Sometimes history doesn't change with a battle, the old rancher would later say. Sometimes it changes the moment a man decides to treat a stranger like a human being. West Texas, late spring of 1944. The land stretched so wide it seemed to swallow sound itself. Mesquite trees leaned under a dry wind that carried dust across miles of open pasture, and the sun climbed slow and steady over a horizon that never seemed to end. At the edge of a county road outside Abilene stood Callahan Ranch, 1,200 acres of cattle land, cedar fencing, and weathered barns that had seen 2 generations of hard seasons. The morning began like every other morning Jack Callahan had known since he was old enough to swing a hammer. Coffee black as motor oil, boots on wood floorboards, the smell of leather, hay, and sun-warmed dust drifting through the open kitchen window. Jack was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet by habit, the kind of man who spoke only when he meant what he said. His younger brother was somewhere in Europe wearing an army uniform. Half the young men in Taylor County were gone the same way. War had emptied towns across Texas, leaving ranchers with cattle to feed, fences to mend, and fields that did not care about headlines from overseas. By government order and wartime necessity, some of that missing labor had been replaced by prisoners of war held at camps scattered across the South. Germans, mostly. Soldiers captured in North Africa or Italy, shipped across the Atlantic and assigned to farms and ranches where work never stopped. People in town had argued about it when the first transport trucks arrived months earlier. Some called it dangerous. Others said work was work, and the Geneva Convention meant they would be treated decently. Jack had not said much at all. Ranchers learned early that opinions rarely fixed broken fence posts. But that morning the quiet rhythm of ranch life shifted in a way he did not yet understand. The change arrived not with noise, but with movement on the road. A military transport truck rolled slowly through the dust, tires crunching gravel, sunlight flashing against the dull green paint of its steel panels. It stopped near the outer gate of the ranch where a temporary work detail had been assigned. Jack stepped out onto the porch and watched without hurry, hat low over his eyes. He had seen trucks like that before. Prisoner work crews came and went depending on what fields needed clearing or what barns needed repairing. Usually the men climbed down first, stiff from the ride, guarded by 2 soldiers with clipboards and rifles slung loosely across their shoulders. But this time something looked different. When the back gate of the truck swung open, the first figure who stepped down was not a man. She moved carefully, boots touching the Texas dirt as if she were measuring the ground beneath her. The uniform she wore was plain gray cotton marked with the letters PW. Her hair, pulled back tightly at the nape of her neck, was the color of pale wheat before harvest. Behind her, 4 more women followed, each carrying the same quiet posture that people develop when they have learned that dignity is something you protect even when everything else has been taken away. Jack had heard that some camps held female prisoners too, nurses, clerks, radio operators captured alongside collapsing German units overseas, but hearing a thing and seeing it were not the same. The guard accompanying them checked a sheet of paper and spoke briefly to the ranch foreman waiting near the gate. The words carried lightly through the dry air. Temporary labor assignment. Fence repair. Kitchen garden clearing. 8-hour shifts. Water provided. Standard procedure. Routine. The women stood together in a line, not speaking, eyes forward. They did not look frightened the way Jack expected prisoners might look. They looked tired. Not the tired that came from a long day of riding fence lines. A deeper tiredness, the kind that settles behind a person's eyes when they have traveled a long distance through things they do not intend to explain to strangers. Jack leaned one shoulder against the porch column and studied them quietly. One of the women stepped slightly forward when the foreman asked who spoke English. She answered in a voice that carried an accent, but no hesitation. I do. Her name, he would learn later, was Elsa Hartmann, 27 years old, once a medical assistant in a hospital outside Cologne, captured during the Allied advance in Italy the previous year and sent across the ocean to a prisoner camp in Texas that looked nothing like the Europe she had left behind. In that moment, though, Jack knew none of that history. What he noticed instead was something smaller, something easier to overlook. While the others stood rigid in the morning heat, Elsa glanced once toward the pasture beyond the gate, where a young horse shifted restlessly near the fence line. It was not a long look. Just a second, maybe 2. But there was recognition in it. The kind of recognition people have when they understand animals better than they understand crowds. Jack had spent his entire life reading that same expression in ranch hands, veterinarians, and quiet farm kids who knew horses better than they knew conversation. He pushed himself away from the porch rail and walked down the steps, boots thudding softly against the wood. The guard nodded when he approached. "Morning," the soldier said. "Morning," Jack answered. His voice carried the slow rhythm of West Texas, unhurried, practical. He looked at the women again, then at the foreman. "They here for the north fence." The foreman shrugged. "That and whatever else needs doing." Jack tipped his hat slightly toward the group. For a moment nobody spoke. Wind moved through the mesquite trees. Somewhere out in the pasture a gate hinge creaked. Finally Elsa broke the silence. "We will work," she said simply. It was not a plea, not a protest, just a statement of fact delivered with calm precision. Jack nodded once. "Fair enough." He turned toward the pasture road and gestured with 2 fingers. "Fence line's about half a mile that way." The women followed the foreman through the gate. Jack watched them walk across the sunlit ground, their shadows stretching thin over the dust. At the far edge of the field the young horse lifted its head again, ears forward, curious about the unfamiliar figures moving along the fence posts. Elsa slowed slightly as they passed the animal. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for Jack Callahan to see something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. She spoke to the horse in a language he did not understand, her voice low and steady, the same tone a rancher might use to calm a restless colt. The horse relaxed almost immediately. It lowered its head and returned to grazing. Jack stood there for another moment beneath the wide Texas sky, dust moving around his boots, the morning sun warming the brim of his hat. Later, when people asked, when the strange story began, the one that would eventually reach Washington itself, he would remember that exact second. Not the truck, not the uniforms, just a quiet sentence spoken to a horse in the middle of a pasture. Because sometimes history does not begin with gunfire or speeches. Sometimes it begins with a small act of calm in a place where no one expects it, and a man who happens to notice. By late morning the sun had climbed high enough to bleach the color from the pasture grass, turning the land into a pale sheet of light that shimmered above the dry earth. The work detail moved slowly along the north fence line, replacing warped cedar posts and tightening lengths of wire that had loosened during the winter winds. The rhythm of ranch work was simple and patient. A post pulled from the ground, a new one set straight, a hammer rising and falling with a sound that carried across the open fields like a steady clock. Elsa Hartmann worked beside the others without complaint, her movements precise, economical, almost practiced. She handled tools with the quiet focus of someone who had learned long ago that attention to detail often meant the difference between order and chaos. The foreman noticed it first. Most prisoners assigned to ranch work arrived stiff from travel, unfamiliar with the tools or the pace of open land. They hesitated, asked questions, sometimes made mistakes that slowed the crew down. Elsa did not. She watched once, understood, and then moved with calm efficiency that surprised the men supervising the line. She measured wire length with careful fingers, twisted the ends tight, and stepped back to examine the fence the way a craftsperson studies a finished piece before calling it complete. Jack Callahan rode out from the barn just before noon, guiding his horse at an easy pace along the dusty service road that paralleled the fence line. From a distance, he could see the small group of figures working under the relentless Texas sky. The ranch spread wide enough that a man could ride for 20 minutes and still remain on his own land. That morning Jack was not riding to supervise the prisoners. He had already spent the early hours checking cattle near the creek bed and repairing a loose gate near the south pasture. But something about the quiet steadiness of that new work. Crew lingered in his mind longer than he expected. The horse slowed as they approached the fence. Jack rested one hand lightly on the saddle horn and studied the scene in front of him. The foreman wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. The guard leaned against a truck parked under the thin shade of a mesquite tree, flipping through a small notebook. The women continued working with the same calm discipline they had shown since stepping off the transport earlier that morning. Elsa stood a few yards away from the others, twisting a fresh strand of wire around a new cedar post. When she finished, she pressed her palm lightly against the wood as if checking its balance. Jack noticed the gesture immediately. It was not necessary for the task, but it revealed something about the way she approached work. Careful, observant. The horse shifted its weight beneath him, and the faint sound of leather creaking carried across the quiet pasture. Elsa looked up. For a moment her eyes met Jack's from across the distance. There was no hostility in her expression and no attempt at conversation. Only awareness. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement that he existed in the same space she did. Then she returned to the fence as if nothing had happened. Jack tipped the brim of his hat in response, though he was not certain she saw the gesture. He rode closer to the foreman. "How are they doing?" he asked. The foreman glanced toward the women and shrugged in mild surprise. "Better than half the hands we used to hire before the war," he said. "They work steady. No trouble." Jack watched Elsa again as she lifted a coil of wire from the ground and carried it toward the next post. Her steps were measured, balanced, as if conserving energy rather than wasting it. It was the kind of movement Jack recognized from experienced ranch workers who knew that pacing themselves under the Texas sun was the only way to finish a day's labor. A sudden sound interrupted the quiet rhythm of the field. The young horse grazing near the fence lifted its head and trotted nervously along the boundary line, disturbed by the unfamiliar activity nearby. The animal moved quickly, circling the pasture with restless energy. Elsa paused and turned toward it again. This time she stepped closer to the fence and rested her hands lightly on the top wire. The horse slowed as it approached. Jack watched from the saddle without speaking. Elsa spoke a few soft words in German, her tone low and steady. The language was unfamiliar, but the meaning carried easily through the air. Calm. Reassurance. The horse stopped several yards away and flicked its ears forward, listening. After a moment it lowered its head and resumed grazing as if the tension had never existed. The foreman let out a quiet whistle. "You see that?" he muttered. Jack nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. They stood there for another minute in thoughtful silence while the wind moved through the grass. Ranchers believed in small observations. A man could tell a great deal about another person from the way they handled animals, tools, or silence. Elsa returned to the fence line again and continued working beside the others as if calming the horse had been the most ordinary part of her day. The sun climbed higher. Noon arrived with the sharp brightness that defined summer in West Texas. The foreman called for a break, and the workers stepped back from the fence to drink water from a large metal cooler set near the truck. Elsa waited until the others finished before approaching the container. She filled a tin cup slowly, took a careful sip, and set the cup back down without spilling a drop. Jack dismounted and tied his horse loosely to a nearby post. The guard glanced at him, but did not object. Ranch owners were expected to move freely across their own land. Jack walked toward the cooler, dust shifting beneath his boots. Elsa stood a few feet away, her attention focused on the distant pasture where the horse had wandered again. Jack cleared his throat lightly, not out of nervousness, but out of habit when beginning a conversation. "You worked with horses before," he said. Elsa turned toward him. For a brief moment, she seemed surprised that he had spoken directly to her. Then she nodded once. "My grandfather had a small farm," she replied in careful English. "Before the war." Jack studied her expression. There was no bitterness in the statement, only a quiet acknowledgement that the world had once been different. "They can sense when someone is calm," Jack said, gesturing toward the pasture. Elsa followed his gaze. "Animals understand tone," she answered. "They listen. More than people do." Jack allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile at that observation. The wind shifted across the open land, carrying the distant smell of hay from the barns near the house. For a few seconds neither of them spoke again. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of pause that often existed between strangers who had not yet decided whether conversation was necessary. Finally the foreman called the workers back to the fence. Elsa nodded politely and returned to the line. Jack watched her walk away across the bright field, the sun catching briefly in her pale hair before she reached the shadow of the mesquite trees. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle again. As he rode slowly back toward the barns, a thought settled quietly in his mind. There were thousands of prisoners scattered across the country that year, men and women from a distant continent whose stories most Americans would never hear. But sometimes, on a wide stretch of Texas land under an endless sky, one of those stories began to take shape in the smallest possible way. Not with conflict, not with argument, just with a conversation beside a water cooler and the calm voice of a woman who understood how to speak to a restless horse. The afternoon settled slowly across Callahan Ranch, the way long Texas afternoons always did, stretching the hours until the land itself seemed to breathe in slow rhythm with the sun. By 2 o'clock the heat had settled deep into the earth, warming the dust beneath every boot step and turning the distant horizon into a pale shimmer that moved like water even though the nearest river lay miles away. The fence repair continued along the north pasture, each post set carefully into the ground. Each line of wire tightened until it sang faintly when the wind touched it. Elsa Hartmann worked with the same steady focus she had shown since morning, her sleeves rolled neatly at the wrists, her movements precise and controlled. She did not speak much while working, but she observed everything. The way the ranch hands measured distance between the posts. The way the foreman checked tension in the wire by tapping it lightly with a wrench. The way the American guard shaded his eyes every few minutes to watch the horizon beyond the pasture. Ranch. Work had its own language, and Elsa was learning it quickly without asking anyone to explain it to her. Jack Callahan noticed that from across the field where he had returned to check the progress along the fence line. He stood beside his horse for a moment, resting his hands on the saddle horn while watching the group move slowly through their tasks. Ranchers believed in quiet observation. A man who talked too much rarely noticed the things that mattered. Elsa finished tying another wire and stepped back to examine the post. A strand had twisted unevenly. She knelt in the dust and adjusted it with careful fingers until the line ran straight again. The foreman saw it and nodded with approval even though he said nothing out loud. That kind of detail mattered on a ranch. A fence built carelessly would not survive the first strong wind or the pressure of a 1,000-pound steer leaning against it. By mid-afternoon, the crew reached the corner of the pasture where a narrow gate connected two fields. The gate had sagged slightly during the winter storms, its hinges pulled crooked from the cedar post. The foreman scratched his chin and studied it for a moment. "That one needs lifting," he said to the guard. "Otherwise it will drag every time we open it." Elsa stepped closer and examined the hinge quietly. Jack watched from a distance as she crouched near the gatepost. She placed her hand against the wood, then looked at the hinge again. Finally she stood and spoke in careful English. "If you raise the bottom hinge half an inch, the weight will balance again." The foreman raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Elsa nodded once. "Yes." The wood settled unevenly. "The top hinge is holding too much weight." The foreman glanced at Jack, who had ridden closer to the corner of the pasture. Jack dismounted slowly and walked over to inspect the gate. He studied the hinges for a moment without speaking. Then he lifted the gate slightly and tested the movement. The hinge creaked, and the wood shifted exactly the way Elsa had predicted. Jack looked toward her. "You worked with gates before too?" he asked. Elsa shook her head gently. "No, but the problem is simple." Jack adjusted the hinge bolts with a wrench from the tool bag hanging on the fence. When he lowered the gate again, it swung smoothly, no longer dragging against the ground. The foreman chuckled quietly. "Well, I will be," he said. "That saved us 10 minutes of arguing with the hinges." Elsa gave a small nod and stepped back without claiming any credit for the solution. Jack noticed that as well. Some people rushed to explain how clever they were. Others simply returned to work. Elsa picked up the hammer again and continued along the fence line beside the others as if nothing unusual had happened. The afternoon stretched onward. Shadows from the mesquite trees grew longer across the field. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a windmill turned slowly, its metal blades catching the light each time they rotated. Jack walked back toward his horse but paused when he heard a familiar sound drifting across the land. The young horse from earlier had wandered near the fence again. This time the animal pushed its nose curiously through the wire toward the workers. The guard shifted his stance as if preparing to shoo it away, but Elsa raised one hand slightly in a quiet signal asking him to wait. She stepped closer to the fence and rested her palm lightly on the top wire again. The horse studied her with dark, attentive eyes. Elsa spoke softly, her voice calm and even. The words were German, but the tone carried the same gentle reassurance Jack had heard that morning. The horse lowered its head and sniffed her hand through the fence wire before stepping back to graze. The guard looked puzzled but amused. "Well, that is something," he muttered. Jack gave a small smile beneath the brim of his hat. Animals recognized patience the same way people did, sometimes faster. The foreman called for another water break as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The crew gathered near the truck again, dust clinging lightly to their boots and clothes after hours of work. Elsa drank carefully from the same tin cup as before, then rinsed it with a splash of water before setting it back beside the cooler. Jack leaned against the truck bed while the others rested. The wind had cooled slightly, carrying the scent of distant rain even though the sky remained clear. Elsa noticed it too and looked toward the western horizon. "Storm?" she asked quietly. Jack followed her gaze. Far beyond the pastures a faint line of darker clouds touched the edge of the sky. "Maybe tomorrow," he said. "Out here you learn not to trust the forecast." Elsa considered that for a moment, then nodded. "In Germany the weather changes quickly too," she said. Jack tilted his head slightly. "You miss it?" Elsa did not answer immediately. She watched the grass move in the wind and the slow rotation of the windmill in the distance. Finally she spoke in a calm, thoughtful voice. "I miss quiet mornings," she said. Jack glanced around the ranch land stretching in every direction. "This place has plenty of those." Elsa allowed the faintest trace of a smile. "Yes," she said softly. For a few seconds they both stood in silence, listening to the wind move across the wide Texas pasture. The moment passed naturally when the foreman clapped his hands and signaled that the break was over. The workers returned to the fence line to finish the final section before evening. Jack watched them move away again through the long shadows of the mesquite trees. Something about the rhythm of the day felt different now, though he could not yet explain why. Perhaps it was the quiet competence Elsa carried with her. Perhaps it was the calm way she approached every task, whether it involved wire fences, restless horses, or sagging gate hinges. Whatever the reason, Jack found himself paying attention in a way he had not expected when the truck first arrived that morning. The sun drifted lower toward the western hills, painting the sky with pale shades of gold and amber. The land cooled slowly as evening approached, and the fence line stretched straight and solid across the pasture, each post set firm against the coming winds. Somewhere behind Jack the windmill continued its slow, steady turning, marking time across the quiet Texas ranch where a story had begun unfolding almost too quietly for anyone to notice. Evening arrived across the ranch the way it always had, quietly and without ceremony. The sun slipped lower toward the western horizon, softening the harsh brightness that had ruled the afternoon. Long shadows stretched across the pasture, and the wind that moved through the mesquite trees carried a cooler breath now, one that hinted the long day was finally loosening its grip on the land. The work crew finished the final section of fence just as the light began to turn amber. The last cedar post went into the ground with 3 steady strikes of the hammer. Wire was pulled tight and twisted into place. When the foreman stepped back and ran his palm lightly along the finished line, the fence stood straight from one corner of the pasture to the other, a quiet testament to a day of careful labor. The guard checked his watch and closed his notebook with a soft snap. The truck engine started again, rumbling low in the quiet field. Elsa Hartmann wiped the dust from her hands against the sides of her work trousers before gathering the remaining tools from the ground. The others moved with the slow stiffness that came after hours beneath the Texas sun. Even the air felt tired now, warm and still as the last of the daylight settled over the land. Jack Callahan stood near the barn gate watching the truck approach from across the pasture road. The dust rose behind it in a pale cloud that glowed in the fading sunlight. Ranch life returned to its evening rhythm around him. Cattle shifted slowly toward the watering trough. A pair of barn swallows darted low over the grass, chasing insects that hovered in the cooling air. The windmill turned with its steady creak, marking time the same way it had for decades. When the truck rolled to a stop near the main gate, the guard stepped down first. The women climbed carefully from the back of the vehicle, their boots touching the dirt with the same quiet discipline they had shown all day. Elsa was the last to step down. For a brief moment, she paused beside the truck and looked out across the ranch as if memorizing the open land. It was a simple glance, but it carried the quiet weight of someone who had spent months surrounded by fences and watchtowers before seeing a horizon this wide. The guard gestured politely toward the road that would take them back to the camp several miles away. The work detail would return again the next morning. That was the arrangement the government had set in place across much of the country during the war. Prisoners worked during the day. They returned to their assigned camps by evening. Routine kept things orderly. Routine kept questions from growing too large. Jack leaned against the wooden gatepost as the group began walking toward the truck again. Elsa turned slightly as she passed him, offering the same small nod she had given earlier in the day. It was not a gesture of familiarity. It was simply respect. Jack tipped his hat in return. The truck engine growled to life and rolled slowly down the ranch road, carrying the workers back toward the distant camp beyond the hills. Jack watched the dust trail fade until the vehicle disappeared behind a curve in the road. For a while he remained standing at the gate, listening to the quiet settle over the pasture again. The ranch seemed larger in the evening light. The land stretched outward in soft shades of bronze and gold, every fence line casting a long shadow across the grass. Eventually Jack turned and walked toward the barn where his horse waited patiently beside the rail fence. He loosened the saddle strap and brushed the dust from the animal's coat with slow, practiced movements. Horses had a way of noticing when a person's mind drifted somewhere else. The animal shifted slightly, but remained calm under his hands. "Long day," Jack murmured quietly, though he was not entirely certain whether he was speaking to the horse or to himself. The animal flicked its ears and lowered its head. Beyond the barn, the evening sky deepened into a wide blue field dotted with the first faint stars. Supper came and went in the small ranch house the way it always did. Coffee warmed on the stove. A simple plate of beans and cornbread sat on the kitchen table. Jack ate slowly while the radio played low in the corner, broadcasting distant news from across the ocean where armies moved across maps that most ranchers would never see in person. The announcer spoke about troop movements, supply lines, and meetings in Washington where officials debated decisions that stretched across continents. Jack listened quietly for a few minutes before switching the radio off. The ranch had its own clock, and it did not run on the same schedule as government offices or war briefings. After supper, he stepped outside onto the porch again. Night had settled fully now. The wind carried a cool edge across the open fields. In the distance, the windmill turned slowly under the starlight, its steady rhythm sounding almost like breathing in the quiet darkness. Jack leaned against the porch rail and looked out. Across the land, somewhere far beyond the hills, the prisoner camp lights would be glowing faintly against the night sky. Hundreds of men and women from another continent sleeping behind fences while the war continued to reshape the world beyond them. Jack thought briefly about the day's work along the north pasture fence. The straight line of cedar posts, the careful twist of wire, the calm voice of a woman speaking to a restless horse in a language he did not understand. It was a small memory in the larger scale of the war, but it remained clear in his mind. Ranch life had taught him that certain moments revealed more about a person than long conversations ever could. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of rain from somewhere far out on the plains. Jack looked toward the western horizon, where distant clouds gathered slowly under the moonlight. Tomorrow would bring another long day of work. The truck would return in the morning. The fence line still needed inspection. The cattle would need checking before the storm arrived. Routine would continue the way it always had on the ranch. But as Jack stood there beneath the quiet Texas sky, he sensed that something subtle had already begun to change. Not in the land. The land moved at its own patient pace. The change had begun in the quiet space between two strangers who had exchanged only a few words beside a fence line and a water cooler. Sometimes the first step in a story did not feel dramatic when it happened. It felt ordinary, a nod of respect, a simple conversation about weather and work, a moment of calm shared across a fence under the wide, open sky. Yet those small moments had a way of growing into something larger than anyone expected. And out on that quiet stretch of Texas land, the wind moving softly through the mesquite trees seemed to carry the first hint that this story had only just begun. Morning returned to Callahan Ranch with the pale silver light that arrives just before the Texas sun fully clears the horizon. The air felt cooler than the day before, and the wind carried the distant smell of rain from somewhere beyond the rolling plains. Jack Callahan stepped out onto the porch with a tin cup of coffee in his hand and paused to watch the early light stretch across the pasture. The land was quiet at that hour. Cattle moved slowly near the far fence line. A lone hawk drifted through the wide sky above the windmill. The ranch woke gradually, the way it always had, one small sound at a time. A gate hinge creaked. A barn door opened. Leather tack shifted against a wooden rail. Jack finished the last sip of coffee and set the cup on the porch railing before walking down toward the barn. He saddled his horse with practiced movements, tightening the strap beneath the animal's chest and checking the stirrups the same way he had every morning since boyhood. Ranch work waited for no one, war or no war. But that morning there was a quiet expectation in the air that had not been there the day before. The prisoner work truck usually arrived shortly after sunrise. It was part of the routine the county had grown used to since the camps opened. Prisoners worked fields and ranches across the region during daylight hours, then returned to the camp by evening under guard. The system kept farms running while so many American men served overseas. Jack mounted his horse and rode out toward the North Pasture Road just as the sun finally broke above the distant hills. Golden lights spilled across the grass, catching the dew that still clung to the ground. The fence they had repaired yesterday stood straight and solid in the morning light. Jack slowed his horse near the corner gate and studied the line of cedar posts. A rancher measured work not by how quickly it was done, but by how well it held up when the wind came. He leaned slightly forward in the saddle and ran a gloved hand along the wire. Tight, clean, the kind of work that lasted. The distant rumble of an engine reached him a few minutes later. Jack turned his head toward the road that curved through the mesquite trees. The transport truck appeared through a light cloud of dust, rolling slowly toward the ranch gate the same way it had the morning before. When it stopped, the guard stepped out first and checked his clipboard before opening the back gate. The women climbed down one by one. Their gray uniforms looked cleaner in the fresh morning light, though the dust of the Texas plains never stayed away. For long, Elsa Hartmann stepped down last again, her boots touching the ground with the same steady balance Jack had noticed before. She glanced briefly across the pasture, and for a moment her eyes met his from across the distance. Jack raised a hand in greeting. Not a wave exactly, just a small motion of acknowledgement beneath the brim of his hat. Elsa nodded once in return. The foreman approached the truck and exchanged a few quick words with the guard about the day's assignment. A section of irrigation ditch near the garden field needed clearing after the previous winter storms had filled it with sand and debris. It was not glamorous work, but ranch work rarely was. The group walked toward the field carrying shovels and tools while Jack guided his horse along the fence line beside them. The early sunlight stretched their shadows long across the ground. The irrigation ditch ran nearly a quarter-mile along the edge of the pasture, its shallow channel partially buried under wind-blown dirt. Water from the nearby well passed through that channel to feed the vegetable garden that supplied the ranch house. If the ditch clogged, the entire system slowed down. The foreman pointed toward the first section. "We clear from here to the gate," he said. "Steady pace, and we will finish before noon." The workers stepped into the ditch and began shoveling the loose sand aside. Elsa worked beside another woman, lifting each shovel of dirt with controlled rhythm rather than rushing. Jack dismounted near the well pump and tied his horse loosely to a fence rail. From there, he could watch the work crew without interfering. The sun climbed higher, warming the air again. The steady scrape of shovels against dry soil created a quiet rhythm that echoed along the shallow ditch. After nearly an hour, the channel had begun to take shape again, its narrow path visible beneath the cleared sand. Elsa paused briefly to brush dust from her hands before stepping forward to examine the next section. She crouched beside the ditch and studied the slope of the ground for a moment. Jack noticed her expression shift slightly, the way a person looks when they recognize a small problem others might overlook. She stood and approached the foreman. "If the channel curves 2 feet closer to the fence," she said carefully, "the water will move faster. It will not pool here." The foreman scratched his chin thoughtfully and stepped down into the ditch to inspect the ground where she pointed. Jack walked closer as well. The soil dipped slightly near the middle of the channel, creating a shallow pocket where water might slow after heavy rain. Elsa traced the curve in the dirt with the toe of her boot to show the adjustment she suggested. The foreman nodded slowly. "That might work," he said. Jack picked up a shovel leaning against the fence and pushed a small section of dirt aside to test the slope. The change was subtle but clear. Water would flow more smoothly along the new line. Jack looked up toward Elsa. "You studied engineering?" he asked lightly. Elsa shook her head with a faint smile. "No," she replied. "Hospitals have drainage systems too." The foreman chuckled quietly and handed the shovel back to one of the workers. "Well then," he said. Let us follow the nurse's advice. The ditch line shifted slightly closer to the fence as they continued working. Within another hour, the shallow channel stretched clean and straight toward the garden field. When the foreman opened the well valve, a narrow stream of water began moving through the ditch, flowing smoothly along the new curve Elsa had suggested. The current traveled the full length of the channel without pooling once. The foreman gave an approving nod. Jack rested his hands on the fence rail and watched the water move across the field under the bright Texas sun. Small solutions often carried the most weight on a ranch. Elsa stepped out of the ditch and wiped her hands against her sleeves before stepping back to watch the water flow. She did not celebrate the success or point out that the idea had been hers. She simply observed the result quietly, the way she had done with the fence line the day before. Jack found himself studying her again, the same way a rancher studies the weather or the land itself, looking for patterns that reveal something deeper beneath the surface. Some people filled silence with unnecessary words. Others carried a calm presence that seemed to steady everything around them. Elsa Hartmann belonged to the second kind. The wind shifted across the pasture, bending the tall grass slightly as the water continued its steady path along the ditch. Somewhere behind the barn, a rooster crowed late, as if only just remembering that morning had already arrived. The work crew rested beside the fence for a moment while the foreman checked the final section of the channel. Jack glanced toward the open sky above the ranch. The faint clouds he had noticed the night before were drifting closer now, forming a pale line along the western horizon. Rain would come eventually. Out on the plains it always did. And when it arrived, the water would follow the path carved quietly that morning by a group of workers beneath the Texas sun, including a woman from a distant country who understood how small adjustments could change the way things flowed. The water continued to move steadily through the irrigation ditch long after the crew stepped away from it, sliding along the shallow channel Elsa had helped reshape until it reached the narrow garden field behind the barn. The sound was quiet but constant, a soft running whisper against the dry Texas soil. Jack Callahan stood beside the fence rail watching it for a moment longer than necessary, as ranchers often did when something simple worked exactly the way it should. The sun climbed slowly toward midday, bright and steady above the wide open sky. Heat began rising from the pasture again, carrying the dry scent of cedar posts and warm dust. The work crew rested near the well pump where a metal bucket sat half filled with cool water drawn from deep beneath the ground. Elsa Hartmann wiped her hands against the sides of her trousers before reaching for the tin cup that rested beside the bucket. She filled it carefully and drank without hurry, her eyes drifting toward the irrigation channel where the water continued its smooth path through the ditch. The foreman leaned against the pump handle and followed her gaze. "You were right about that curve," he said in a voice that carried the quiet approval of a man who respected practical solutions. Elsa lowered the cup and gave a small nod. "Water follows the easiest path," she replied calmly. "If the ground helps it, the flow becomes simple." Jack heard the exchange from a few yards away where he had been checking the wooden frame around the well pump. He stepped closer, resting one boot on the lower rail of the fence while studying the line of water cutting through the field. "That ditch has been clogging every spring for 3 years," he said thoughtfully. "Nobody thought to move the line a little." Elsa looked toward the shallow channel again. "Sometimes small changes are easier than large repairs," she answered. Jack smiled faintly at that. Ranch life had taught him the same lesson many times. A loose hinge fixed early saved a broken gate later. A careful fence line kept cattle where they belonged. The guard standing near the truck glanced down at his watch before closing the notebook he carried. 10 more minutes, he said to the group. Then we moved to the garden rows. The workers gathered their tools again and walked slowly toward the vegetable field that spread behind the ranch house. The soil there was darker and softer than the surrounding pasture, carefully turned and planted weeks earlier with rows of beans, squash, and corn that had begun pushing green leaves through the earth. The irrigation ditch curved neatly along the edge of the garden, feeding water into a smaller channel that passed between the planted rows. Jack walked beside the fence line while the others stepped carefully into the field. The foreman handed out short-handled hose used to loosen soil around the growing plants. Elsa knelt beside the first row and studied the ground for a moment before beginning her work. She moved the hose slowly, lifting small clumps of dirt away from the base of each plant so the roots could breathe. The motion was steady and controlled, almost gentle. Jack noticed the way she paused occasionally to brush loose soil away with her hand rather than striking too hard with the tool. "You worked in gardens before too?" he asked from the edge of the row. Elsa looked up briefly. "My mother kept a small one behind our house," she said. "Vegetables were important during the war." Jack nodded quietly. Food had become important everywhere during those years. Across the country, families planted gardens in backyards, empty lots, and school fields to support the war effort. The radio called them victory gardens. Ranchers simply called them necessary. The sun drifted higher above the ranch while the workers moved slowly along the garden rows. A breeze crossed the open pasture now and then, bending the tall grass beyond the fence and carrying the faint promise of rain from the distant horizon. Jack noticed the sky changing as he worked. The pale clouds he had seen earlier in the morning were spreading slowly across the western sky, forming soft gray shapes that grew thicker by the hour. Texas weather often arrived without warning, and ranchers learned to watch the sky the way sailors watch the sea. Elsa finished clearing the soil around one row of beans and sat back on her heels for a moment. Her gaze lifted toward the horizon where the clouds gathered. "Storm this afternoon," she said quietly. The foreman followed her eyes and squinted into the distance. "Maybe," he replied. "Hard to say." Elsa brushed her hands together and stood, wiping a streak of dust from her sleeve. "The wind changed," she explained. Jack stepped closer to the edge of the garden and felt the air for himself. The breeze had indeed shifted, carrying a cooler note beneath the warmth of the sun. It was subtle, but noticeable. "You watch the weather too?" he asked. Elsa nodded once. "Hospitals depend on it," she said. "Rain changes many things." Jack considered that answer while glancing again toward the sky. Out on the plains, a storm could change an entire day's work in minutes. Fields flooded. Roads turned to mud. Cattle scattered across open pasture if fences were weak. The foreman straightened slowly and rested his hands on his hips while studying the clouds building over the distant hills. "We should finish this row before the rain arrives," he said. The workers returned to their tasks with renewed focus. The soil loosened quickly beneath the hose, leaving neat rows of dark earth around each plant. The irrigation water continued its steady movement along the ditch beside the garden, feeding the young crops that swayed gently in the strengthening wind. Jack remained near the fence watching the field for a moment longer. Elsa moved down the row with quiet determination, her attention fixed on the ground beneath her hands. There was no rush in her work, only a steady rhythm that seemed to match the pace of the ranch itself. A low rumble of distant thunder drifted across the plains not long after. It was faint, almost lost beneath the sound of wind brushing through the mesquite trees. Elsa looked toward the sky again. "Yes," she said softly, almost to herself. "The rain is coming." Jack tipped his hat back slightly and followed her. Gazed toward the horizon where the clouds had grown darker now, gathering strength above the wide Texas land. The storm was still miles away, but its arrival was certain. And as the workers continued their quiet labor among the rows of green plants, the first cool gust of wind swept gently across Callahan Ranch, carrying with it the promise that the dry earth would soon receive the rain it had been waiting for. The wind arrived first. Not strong, not violent, but steady enough that every blade of grass across the pasture began to lean in the same direction. The sky above Callahan Ranch had darkened slightly since the morning, the pale blue fading beneath a slow-moving ceiling of gray clouds drifting in from the western plains. Jack Callahan stood near the fence beside the garden field, one hand resting on the wooden rail while he studied the horizon. Ranchers learned to read weather the way other men read newspapers. The signs were rarely loud. They appeared quietly. A change in wind, a shift in temperature, a silence among the birds that had filled the morning sky only an hour earlier. The workers continued moving along the garden rows, loosening soil around the bean plants and clearing the narrow irrigation channel that carried water past the vegetables. Elsa Hartmann knelt near the middle of the field, brushing dirt away from the base of a young corn stalk with careful fingers. The wind lifted a few strands of her pale hair loose from where it had been tied back earlier that morning. She paused for a moment and looked up again toward the horizon. The distant clouds had thickened, spreading wider across the sky like a slowly opening curtain. Jack noticed the same detail. He stepped away from the fence and walked toward the garden rows where the foreman had paused to watch the sky. "How far do you think it is?" Jack asked quietly. The foreman squinted toward the western hills where the clouds gathered above the open land. 10 miles maybe, he said. "Hard to judge from here." Elsa stood slowly from where she had been working. Dust clung lightly to her sleeves and hands, but her attention remained fixed on the distant sky. "Less," she said calmly. The foreman glanced at her with mild curiosity. "You sure?" Elsa nodded once. "The wind changed twice," she explained. "The air feels heavier." Jack lifted his face slightly toward the breeze and felt the difference for himself. The warmth of the morning sun had faded beneath the growing cloud cover, replaced by a cooler breath that moved across the field. It carried the faint scent of rain that had not yet reached the ground. A low sound rolled across the plains a few seconds later. Thunder. Not loud, just a distant murmur somewhere beyond the hills. The workers paused briefly at the sound, each of them glancing toward the sky. The guard standing near the truck closed his notebook and stepped forward. "We should wrap up the field," he said. "Storm regulations say no work during lightning." Jack nodded once in agreement. Ranch rules followed the same logic. Open land offered little shelter when storms moved across the plains. The foreman raised his voice slightly. "Finish the row you are on," he called out. "Then gather tools." The workers moved with quiet efficiency. The last clumps of soil were cleared from around the plants, and the hoes were stacked neatly beside the irrigation ditch. Elsa stepped out of the row and brushed the dust from her hands again before walking toward the edge of the field. Jack stood beside the fence watching the clouds advance slowly across the sky. The horizon had grown darker now, a long gray band stretching from north to south. Another low rumble of thunder drifted across the land. This time the sound lingered longer. The guard opened the back gate of the transport truck while the foreman gathered the tools and loaded them into the truck bed. Elsa paused beside the irrigation ditch where the water continued flowing steadily through the channel they had cleared earlier that morning. She crouched briefly and touched the edge of the ditch with her hand, watching the current move past the garden rows. Jack stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "You still think the ditch will hold?" he asked. Elsa looked up at him. "Yes," she said. "The slope is correct now." Jack followed the line of water with his eyes. Even with the approaching storm, the flow remained steady and smooth along the shallow curve. "You may have saved us a lot of trouble," he said quietly. Elsa stood and wiped the last of the dirt from her hands. "The land usually tells us what it needs," she replied. "We only have to listen." Jack considered that answer for a moment while the wind picked up again across the pasture. It was the kind of statement that sounded simple but carried a deeper truth behind it. Ranchers spent their lives doing exactly that, listening to the land, watching the sky, reading the quiet signals that told them when to plant, when to repair, when to move cattle before a storm. The guard motioned for the workers to board the truck. One by one they climbed into the back, settling onto the wooden benches along the sides of the truck bed. Elsa stepped up last, gripping the metal rail and pulling herself into the vehicle with the same steady balance Jack had noticed the day before. Before the guard closed the gate, she glanced back toward the garden field and the irrigation ditch where the water continued its quiet path through the soil. Jack tipped his hat once in farewell. Elsa returned the small nod she had given him earlier in the day. The truck engine started with a low rumble, and the vehicle rolled slowly down the ranch road toward the distant hills where the prisoner camp waited beyond the horizon. Jack remained standing beside the fence long after the truck disappeared behind the mesquite trees. The wind moved steadily across the pasture now, bending the tall grass and rattling the leaves along the fence line. The first drop of rain fell a few minutes later, striking the dry dirt near Jack's boot with a soft dark mark. Another followed, then another. Within seconds the sky opened, and a gentle rain began falling across Callahan Ranch. The scent of wet earth rose immediately from the ground, filling the air with the rich smell that always followed the first rainfall after a long stretch of dry weather. Jack looked toward the garden field where the irrigation ditch curved neatly through the soil. Rainwater joined the steady flow of water already moving along the channel, sliding smoothly through the path Elsa had helped shape earlier that day. The current held its line perfectly, carrying the fresh rainwater down the length of the garden without pooling once. Jack leaned against the fence rail and watched the rain fall across the wide Texas pasture. The storm moved calmly over the land, its steady rhythm washing dust from the cedar posts and cooling the dry ground that had waited so long for moisture. In the distance, thunder rolled softly again as the clouds passed overhead. Jack remained there for several minutes, listening to the rain and watching the water move through the ditch. A small adjustment in the earth. A quiet suggestion from a woman who had crossed an ocean during a war. Sometimes that was all it took to change the way things flowed. The rain did not last long, but it changed the entire color of the land. By late afternoon, the clouds had moved east across the plains, leaving behind a sky washed clean and pale blue again above Callahan Ranch. The dry Texas soil drank the rainfall quickly, darkening the ground and filling the air with the rich scent that followed every good storm. Small beads of water still clung to the cedar fence posts and the wide leaves of the squash plants in the garden field. Jack Callahan walked slowly along the edge of the pasture, boots pressing into damp earth that had been hard as stone only a few hours earlier. The irrigation ditch ran clear and steady beside the garden rows, carrying the rainwater along the curved path Elsa Hartmann had suggested that morning. Jack crouched near the edge of the ditch and watched the current move past a cluster of small rocks that had collected near the bend. The water did not slow. It did not pool. It simply followed the line that had been shaped into the soil and continued toward the far end of the field. Jack reached down and brushed a small piece of debris away from the flow. The current carried it forward immediately. The adjustment had worked exactly as Elsa predicted. He stood again and looked out across the wide pasture. The land stretched quiet and open beneath the clearing sky. Cattle had wandered back into the field after the storm, grazing calmly on the damp grass that glistened in the evening sunlight. The windmill near the well pump turned slowly again now that the storm had passed, its metal blades catching the light with each rotation. Jack tipped his hat back slightly and studied the western horizon where the clouds had already faded into thin white streaks. Out on the plains, storms often arrived suddenly and left just as quickly. The ranch had seen that pattern for generations, but the small changes they left behind often lasted longer than the rain itself. Later that evening, Jack sat at the wooden kitchen table in the ranch house with a cup of coffee resting beside his elbow. The radio played softly in the background, delivering distant news from Washington and Europe in a calm, steady voice. The announcer spoke about supply shipments crossing the Atlantic, about military strategy and production numbers. The words drifted through the room without holding much of Jack's attention. Ranch life had a way of narrowing a man's focus to the land in front of him rather than the maps spread across desks in faraway offices. Outside the porch window, the sky deepened slowly toward evening. The damp earth cooled under the fading sunlight, and a faint chorus of insects had already begun rising from the pasture grass. Jack leaned back slightly in his chair and thought about the irrigation ditch again. It was not the kind of problem most people would notice. A shallow channel. A small bend in the ground. But Elsa had seen it immediately. The thought returned to him with quiet clarity. The next morning dawned brighter and warmer than the day before. The rain had washed the air clean, leaving the sky wide and clear above the ranch. Jack stepped onto the porch again with his usual cup of coffee and paused to watch the early light spread across the fields. The pasture looked greener after the storm. Even the fence line seemed to stand straighter in the fresh morning sun. The familiar rumble of the transport truck reached the ranch road shortly after sunrise. Dust rose behind the vehicle as it approached the gate, though the damp ground kept the cloud lighter than usual. Jack walked down from the porch and rested his arms on the wooden rail beside the barn while the truck came to a stop. The guard climbed out first and opened the rear gate. The workers stepped down one by one into the morning light. Elsa Hartmann was among the last again. Her boots touched the ground with the same quiet steadiness Jack had noticed since the first day she arrived. For a moment she glanced toward the garden field behind the barn. The irrigation ditch was not visible from the road, but the direction of the land told its story clearly enough. Jack lifted his hand in greeting. Elsa returned the same small nod she had offered the previous mornings. The foreman walked over with his clipboard tucked under one arm. "We are checking the pasture fence again today," he said to the guard. "Storm may have loosened a few sections." The group gathered their tools and began walking toward the north field where the cedar posts lined the pasture edge. The ground felt softer underfoot after the rain, and small patches of wild grass had already begun standing taller in the moist soil. Jack followed along the fence line on horseback, the reins loose in one hand while the horse moved at an easy walking pace. The crew spread out along the fence and began checking each post carefully. Elsa worked near the middle section, tapping lightly against the wood with the handle of a hammer before tightening the wire where it had loosened slightly during the storm. The movement was methodical, patient, the same steady rhythm she had shown from the beginning. A small sound interrupted the quiet routine a few minutes later. The young horse from the nearby pasture had wandered close to the fence again, drawn by curiosity toward the workers moving along the line. The animal stepped closer, ears forward, watching the group with alert interest. Elsa noticed it first. She paused beside the fence and rested her hand lightly on the top wire again. The horse approached slowly this time, lowering its head until its nose nearly touched the fence. Elsa spoke softly, the familiar German words drifting gently across the quiet pasture. Jack watched from his saddle as the animal relaxed under the calm tone of her voice. The horse stood quietly beside the fence, flicking its tail while the workers continued their tasks. The foreman glanced over his shoulder and chuckled. "Looks like you have a friend," he said. Elsa smiled faintly but kept her attention on the wire she was tightening. "Animals trust routine," she said. Jack guided his horse closer to the fence and rested his arm on the saddle horn while observing the scene. "People do too," he replied. Elsa glanced up briefly at that and met his eyes for a moment. The exchange lasted only a second, but something unspoken passed between them in the quiet air of the pasture. The work continued steadily along the fence line as the morning sun climbed. Higher above Callahan Ranch, the storm had left the land refreshed and calm, and the small irrigation ditch behind the barn continued carrying water smoothly through the garden rows. Sometimes a storm changed everything in a single moment. Other times it simply revealed which small adjustments had already begun shaping the land beneath it. Morning continued unfolding across Callahan Ranch with the quiet patience that defined most days on the Texas plains. The sky remained wide and clear after the previous storm, a pale blue dome stretching endlessly above the pasture. Sunlight warmed the damp ground slowly, drawing thin curls of moisture from the soil where the rain had settled the evening before. Along the north fence line, the work crew moved with steady rhythm, checking cedar posts and tightening strands of wire that had loosened slightly under the weight of the storm winds. The young horse still lingered near the fence, ears forward and curious, its dark eyes following Elsa Hartmann as she moved from post to post with a hammer in one hand and a coil of wire in the other. Jack Callahan sat easily in the saddle a few yards away, his horse shifting its weight lazily while he observed the quiet scene. Ranchers often spent long stretches of time watching rather than speaking. The land had its own pace, and men who tried to rush it rarely lasted long in that life. Elsa finished tightening a strand of wire and stepped back to examine the fence line. The metal hummed faintly when the wind touched it, the sound of tension properly set. She reached out and tapped the wire once more before moving to the next post. Jack noticed the small detail again. She never assumed something was finished without checking it. The foreman noticed as well. He walked down the line with a slow, approving nod. "Good work here," he said to no one in particular, though his eyes paused briefly on Elsa's section of the fence. The guard leaned against the transport truck nearby, turning a page in his small notebook while keeping a casual watch over the crew. Everything about the morning felt calm, the kind of calm that often followed a good rain on the plains. Even the cattle grazing across the pasture seemed more relaxed, moving slowly through the grass that had grown brighter overnight under the fresh moisture. Jack shifted slightly in the saddle and studied the horizon out of habit. Ranchers never stopped watching the sky, even when it looked perfectly clear. But this morning the weather offered no surprises. Only sunlight, open land, and the quiet sound of tools moving against wood and wire. The young horse wandered closer again, nudging its nose against the fence rail as Elsa passed by. She paused beside it and rested her hand gently against the wood, speaking softly again in the same calm tone Jack had heard before. The horse lowered its head slightly as if listening. Jack leaned forward in the saddle with mild curiosity. "That horse is starting to think you belong here," he said. Elsa glanced toward him, her expression thoughtful rather than amused. Animals recognize calm places, she replied. Jack considered that answer while glancing across the ranch. Callahan Ranch had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had broken the first ground there with a mule team long before the highway reached that part of Texas. This land has always been quiet, Jack said after a moment. Elsa looked out across the pasture where the wind moved gently through the grass. Yes, she said softly. I think that is why the animals trust it. The foreman clapped his hands lightly a few minutes later. That is the last section, he announced. Fence looks good all the way to the gate. The workers gathered the remaining tools and carried them back toward the truck while the guard checked his watch again. It was nearing midday, and the routine had become familiar now. Work until the sun reached its highest point, then return to the camp beyond the hills. Elsa walked beside the others toward the vehicle, dust brushing lightly from her boots as she stepped across the pasture road. Jack guided his horse forward until he reached the truck just as the foreman lifted the tool crate into the bed. Elsa paused near the back gate before climbing inside. Jack rested one arm casually across the saddle horn and looked toward her. The ditch held during the rain, he said. Elsa nodded. Water followed the path. Jack allowed himself a faint smile at the simple certainty in her words. It usually does, he said. The guard closed the rear gate and climbed into the driver's seat. The truck engine started with a low rumble, and the vehicle began rolling slowly down the ranch road again, carrying the workers back toward the distant prisoner camp. Jack watched until the dust cloud faded into the horizon. The ranch grew quiet again after the truck disappeared. Only the windmill turned slowly beside the well pump, its metal blades creaking gently as they caught the afternoon breeze. Jack dismounted and walked toward the garden field where the irrigation ditch curved through the soil exactly the way Elsa had shaped it. Water still moved steadily through the channel, feeding the rows of green plants that had grown stronger since the rain. Jack crouched beside the ditch again, resting his forearms on his knees while studying the small current sliding through the dirt. He had spent his entire life on that land, yet sometimes it took an outsider to notice the simplest improvements. The thought stayed with him as he stood and brushed the dust from his gloves. Days passed quickly on the ranch. Work filled the hours from sunrise until long after the evening shadows reached the porch steps. But certain moments lingered longer than others. A quiet suggestion beside a ditch. A calm voice speaking to a restless horse. A small nod exchanged across a fence line. None of those things seemed important when they happened, yet they carried a kind of weight that only revealed itself later. That afternoon Jack rode out across the pasture to check the far cattle fence along the creek bed. The land stretched wide beneath the bright Texas sun, peaceful in a way that felt almost separate from the war unfolding across the ocean. Newspapers and radio broadcasts spoke constantly about battles and government decisions in distant places. But here on the ranch the rhythm remained simple. Water flowed where the land allowed it. Grass grew where the rain touched it. And sometimes, without anyone planning it, 2 people from entirely different worlds found themselves sharing the same quiet stretch of land long enough for something unexpected to begin forming. Jack rode slowly along the fence line, the reins loose in his hand while the horse picked its way through the tall grass. The afternoon wind carried the scent of damp soil and cedar wood across the open field. Somewhere behind him the irrigation ditch continued guiding water through the garden rows, following the path that had been quietly changed only a day earlier. And though the ranch looked exactly the same as it always had beneath the wide Texas sky, Jack sensed that something subtle had begun shifting beneath the routine of those ordinary days. The afternoon sun moved slowly across the wide Texas sky, casting long golden lines over the pasture as another quiet day settled across Callahan Ranch. The air carried the clean scent of damp soil left behind by the previous storm, and the land seemed calmer somehow, as if the rain had pressed a reset into the rhythm of the fields. Jack Callahan guided his horse along the western fence line at an easy pace, letting the animal choose its footing through the tall grass that had begun to grow greener since the rainfall. From that side of the ranch the land stretched nearly a mile before meeting the low hills that marked the far boundary of the property. It was the kind of place where a man could ride for hours and still hear nothing but wind moving through grass and the slow creak of saddle leather. Jack had always liked that quiet. Ranch life did not rush a man. It allowed him to think. And lately his thoughts returned often to the same small details. The irrigation ditch behind the barn. The calm voice of a German woman speaking gently to a restless horse. The careful way she tested each strand of wire before leaving a fence post. None of those things should have mattered very much. Yet they lingered in his mind longer than expected. By the time Jack returned toward the barn, the sun had begun lowering toward the western hills again. The shadows of the cedar fence posts stretched long across the pasture, pointing toward the garden field where the irrigation ditch continued carrying water through the rows of green plants. Jack dismounted beside the barn and removed the saddle slowly, brushing the horse down with steady strokes while the evening breeze cooled the land. A small cloud of dust rose with each motion of the brush, then drifted away on the wind. The ranch house stood quiet behind him, its porch shaded now as the sun dipped lower. Somewhere inside the kitchen window, the radio hummed softly with distant voices discussing war news from Europe. Jack could hear fragments of sentences drifting through the open screen door. Government reports, supply routes, congressional committees reviewing wartime policies. He had learned long ago that the war had many layers far beyond the battlefield. Decisions made in distant offices often traveled quietly through towns and farms across the country. Sometimes those decisions arrived in small ways that few people expected. The following morning dawned clear and bright again. Jack stepped onto the porch just as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the pasture. The familiar sound of the transport truck reached the ranch road a few minutes later. The routine had become predictable now. The truck arrived. The workers stepped down. The day's labor began. But this morning something felt slightly different before the vehicle even reached the gate. The truck slowed earlier than usual and rolled to a stop beside the fence where Jack stood waiting. The guard climbed out and opened the rear gate. The workers stepped down as they always did, Elsa Hartmann among them. But a second military vehicle followed behind the transport truck this time. It was a darker sedan with government markings on the side of the door. The engine shut off, and a man stepped out wearing a pressed uniform that looked far less dusty than the clothes worn by the guards who usually accompanied the labor crews. The foreman noticed it immediately and walked toward the gate with a puzzled expression. Jack rested one hand on the wooden rail and watched quietly as the newcomer approached. The man carried a small leather folder tucked beneath his arm. His boots were polished, his posture precise. The kind of posture that belonged to someone who spent more time in offices than in open fields. He greeted the guard briefly before turning toward the ranch. "Morning," he said in a clear official tone. "I am here regarding a labor assignment review." The foreman blinked once in mild confusion. "Review?" The man opened the leather folder and glanced down at the papers inside. "There have been reports concerning prisoner labor details assigned to agricultural properties in this district," he explained. "Standard procedure requires verification of compliance with federal regulations." Jack remained leaning against the fence rail, listening without interrupting. Ranchers had learned during the war that government officials sometimes arrived without warning. Most visits were routine inspections connected to wartime policies. Still, the presence of the second vehicle drew attention from everyone nearby. Elsa and the other workers stood quietly beside the truck while the conversation continued. The official looked toward them briefly, then back to the foreman. "Your crew includes female prisoners of war," he said. "Correct." The foreman nodded. "That is right." The man wrote a short note in his folder. His gaze shifted slowly across the ranch buildings, the pasture, the irrigation ditch visible near the garden rows. "And they work here regularly?" "Only during assigned hours," the foreman replied. "They return to the camp every afternoon." The official closed the folder halfway and looked toward Jack for the first time. "You are the property owner?" Jack pushed himself away from the fence rail and stepped forward calmly. "That is correct," he said. The man studied him for a moment, as if measuring something that did not appear on the paperwork he carried. Then he nodded once. "I will need to observe the work detail today," he said. "Routine verification." Jack glanced briefly toward Elsa and the other workers standing beside the truck. Elsa remained still, her posture composed as always. She did not speak. She simply watched the conversation unfold with the same quiet attention she gave every task. Jack turned back toward the official. "You are welcome to observe," he said evenly. The man gave a polite nod and stepped aside while the foreman gathered the tools for the morning's work. The crew began walking toward the fence line again. their routine continuing despite the unexpected presence of the visitor. Elsa fell into step with the others, carrying a small hammer and coil of wire just as she had on previous mornings. The official followed at a short distance, making occasional notes in the folder he carried. Jack mounted his horse slowly and guided the animal toward the pasture, watching the group move across the field beneath the bright Texas sky. The ranch looked the same as it always had. Cedar fences, open grass, the windmill turning slowly near the well. Yet the arrival of that second vehicle had introduced a new kind of presence into the quiet rhythm of the land. Government attention had a way of changing the atmosphere of even the most ordinary place. And as Jack rode along the fence line watching the workers begin their tasks again, he sensed that the small, quiet story unfolding across his ranch had just drawn the attention of people far beyond the boundaries of his land. The presence of the government official changed the rhythm of the morning, even though the ranch itself looked exactly the same beneath the wide Texas sky. The sun climbed slowly above the pasture, casting bright light across the cedar fence line, where the workers had begun checking posts and tightening wire again. The air carried the clean scent of damp soil left behind by the storm 2 days earlier, and the wind moved steadily through the tall grass beyond the fence. Jack Callahan guided his horse at a slow walk along the edge of the field, watching the work crew move through their routine. The official followed several yards behind them with his leather folder tucked under his arm, pausing now and then to write notes while studying the scene around him. His polished boots collected dust quickly as he crossed the pasture, but his posture remained precise and controlled. It was the kind of posture that belonged to someone used to offices and formal meetings rather than open ranch land. The foreman led the workers down the fence line while explaining the tasks for the day. "We check every post after the storm," he said, gesturing toward the stretch of cedar posts that ran nearly half a mile along the pasture edge. "If the wire loosens, cattle will find it before we do." The official nodded slightly while writing something in the folder. Elsa Hartmann worked near the center of the line again, carrying the same small hammer and coil of wire she had used during the previous days. Her movements remained steady and careful despite the presence of the observer walking behind them. She tested each strand of wire with the same quiet attention she had always shown, tightening the metal with practiced twists before stepping back to examine the tension. Jack noticed that nothing about her pace changed. The inspection did not rush her work, and it did not slow it either. She simply continued the same routine she had followed since the first day she arrived on the ranch. The official eventually approached the section where Elsa worked. He paused beside the fence post and watched her secure the wire against the cedar wood. "You speak English," he said in a calm but formal tone. Elsa looked up from the wire and nodded once. "Yes," she replied. The official glanced briefly at the notebook in his folder before continuing. "How long have you been assigned to this property?" Elsa rested the hammer against her side while thinking for a moment. 3 days, she said. The man made a short note on the page. "And your work duties include fence maintenance and field labor?" "Yes." Her answer remained simple and direct. The official studied the fence line she had just repaired. The wire stretched straight and tight between the posts, humming faintly in the wind. He tapped the cedar post lightly with his knuckles before writing another note. Jack watched the exchange from his saddle without interrupting. The ranch had seen inspectors before during the war years. Most visits were quick. Officials checked paperwork, asked a few questions, and moved on to the next assignment. But something about this inspection felt slower, more deliberate. The official walked farther down the line and observed the other workers as well. The foreman answered several questions about the schedule of the labor crew and the tasks assigned each day. The guard stood near the truck with his arms folded, listening quietly while the conversation continued across the field. After several minutes, the official closed the leather folder and looked out across the pasture. His gaze traveled slowly over the ranch buildings, the windmill near the well pump, and the garden field behind the barn where the irrigation ditch curved through the rows of green plants. "You operate a garden for the household?" he asked. The foreman nodded. "Vegetables mostly. Beans, squash, corn." The official pointed toward the irrigation channel that carried water through the field. "That ditch appears recently adjusted." Jack guided his horse closer to the group and answered before the foreman could speak. "We improved the drainage after the last storm," he said. The official studied the shallow channel for a moment. Rainwater from the previous night still moved gently through the curve Elsa had shaped in the soil earlier that week. Efficient, the man said quietly. He wrote another brief note in the folder before closing it again. Elsa had returned to her work by then, tightening the final strand of wire along her section of the fence. The young horse from the pasture wandered closer once more, its ears forward with curiosity. Elsa paused and rested her hand lightly against the top rail of the fence. The horse lowered its head toward her voice. When she spoke softly in German, the official noticed the exchange immediately. "You handle livestock as well?" he asked. Elsa looked toward him and shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "I only speak calmly." The horse flicked its tail and returned to grazing beside the fence as if satisfied by the brief interaction. The official observed the moment carefully before turning toward Jack. "Your workers appear well managed," he said. Jack shrugged slightly beneath the brim of his hat. "They do their work," he replied. The man studied Jack for a moment before placing the folder back beneath his arm. "Prisoner labor programs are under increased review," he explained. "Washington wants to ensure regulations are followed precisely." Jack nodded once. "That makes sense." The official looked once more across the ranch. The fence line stretched straight toward the distant hills. The garden rows stood green and orderly beneath the morning sun. The windmill turned slowly beside the well pump. Nothing about the place suggested disorder or neglect. After a moment, the official gave a short, polite nod. "I will complete my report this evening," he said. The foreman acknowledged the statement with a small gesture of his hand. The workers continued their tasks along the fence line, while the official walked back toward the government sedan parked near the gate. Jack remained in the saddle, watching him leave. The ranch returned gradually to its quiet rhythm once the sedan drove away down the dusty road. Only the wind and the faint hum of wire against the cedar posts filled the air again. Elsa finished her section of the fence and stepped back to inspect the line once more before setting the hammer into the tool crate. The work looked solid. The wire remained tight despite the shifting winds. Jack guided his horse slowly along the fence toward the next pasture. From the distance, the ranch looked peaceful beneath the wide Texas sky. But the visit from the official had left a subtle mark on the morning. Government attention had reached the quiet land where small routines played out day after day. And although the ranch returned to its ordinary rhythm once the sedan disappeared beyond the hills, Jack sensed that the quiet story unfolding there had begun traveling farther than the fence line that surrounded his land. The ranch returned to its usual rhythm after the government sedan disappeared. Down the dusty road beyond the mesquite trees, but the air across Callahan Ranch carried a different kind of quiet that afternoon. Nothing visible had changed. The same wind moved through the pasture. The same cedar fence posts stood in their long straight line against the horizon. The same windmill turned slowly beside the well pump, its metal blades creaking softly each time they completed a circle. Yet something subtle had shifted in the atmosphere of the place, the way a pond's surface changes long before a ripple becomes visible. Jack Callahan felt it as he guided his horse across the pasture toward the garden field where the irrigation ditch curved neatly through the rows of green plants. The water continued to move exactly as it had since Elsa Hartmann suggested the small adjustment days earlier. The current slipped smoothly along the shallow bend, feeding the vegetable rows before disappearing beneath the next stretch of soil. Jack watched it for a moment before dismounting beside the fence. Ranchers often trusted their instincts the same way they trusted the weather. Something about the visit from the official had carried a weight beyond simple inspection. The man had not raised his voice. He had not criticized the work. Yet his presence had placed a quiet spotlight on a routine that had once gone unnoticed. Jack leaned one arm against the fence rail and looked out across the garden rows. The workers had already finished their tasks for the day and returned to the transport truck that waited near the ranch gate. From where he stood, he could see the gray shape of the vehicle in the distance. The guard stood beside it while the workers climbed into the back. Elsa stepped up last as she always did, her movements steady and calm even after hours beneath the Texas sun. Jack tipped his hat toward her across the field. She returned the small nod she had given every afternoon since the first day she arrived. The truck engine started a moment later and rolled slowly down the ranch road toward the hills that hid the prisoner camp beyond them. Dust rose briefly behind the tires before settling again into the quiet pasture air. Jack remained standing beside the fence long after the vehicle disappeared. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the garden field. Somewhere beyond the barn a rooster called once, then fell silent again. The ranch looked peaceful, but the world beyond it was shifting in ways that often arrived without warning. The following morning began with the same pale light that always touched the plains just before sunrise. Jack stepped onto the porch of the ranch house with his usual cup of coffee and watched the sky brighten slowly above the pasture. The windmill turned lazily in the early breeze. Cattle moved across the far field with the unhurried patience of animals that understood the land better than any map ever could. When the transport truck arrived again along the ranch road, Jack noticed something different immediately. Only the single vehicle approached the gate this time. The government sedan from the previous day did not return. But the guard who stepped down from the truck looked slightly more serious than usual. He spoke quietly with the foreman while the rear gate opened and the workers climbed down onto the dusty ground. Elsa stepped down with them, her eyes scanning the field briefly before settling on the fence line where the morning work would begin. Jack leaned against the wooden rail near the barn and waited while the guard finished speaking with the foreman. After a moment, the foreman walked toward Jack with a thoughtful expression. "New instructions came from the district office this morning," he said quietly. Jack raised an eyebrow. "About what?" The foreman glanced back toward the truck where the workers were gathering their tools. "They want detailed records now," he said. "Work hours, assignments, everything." Jack looked toward the fence line where Elsa had already begun checking the wire tension on the first cedar post. Her movements remained calm and methodical, exactly the same as every other morning. "That seems like a lot of paperwork for fence repairs," Jack replied. The foreman gave a small shrug. "Orders from Washington." Jack did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched Elsa move down the line to the next post, tapping the wire once with the hammer before tightening the twist. The metal hummed faintly in the breeze. The young horse wandered close again from the pasture, its ears forward as it approached the familiar figure beside the fence. Elsa paused and spoke softly to the animal in German while resting her hand against the top rail. The horse lowered its head, calmly, and remained beside her while she continued working. Jack felt the quiet weight of the moment settle again over the land. Government orders might travel through offices and military channels, but the work on the ranch still followed the simple rhythm of the earth. The sun climbed higher across the sky while the workers moved along the fence line, checking posts one by one. The foreman made occasional notes in a small notebook now, recording the tasks completed during the morning hours. The guard watched from beside the truck. Jack rode slowly along the pasture edge, keeping the same quiet distance he had kept during the previous days. The ranch looked unchanged beneath the bright Texas sky. Yet somewhere far beyond the hills, reports and records were beginning to move through offices where people studied details from places they had never seen. The story unfolding across Callahan Ranch was still small. A labor crew repairing fences. A garden ditch carrying water through a field. A quiet exchange between a rancher and a prisoner from another country. But stories had a way of growing once they reached the attention of distant desks and official reports. As Jack guided his horse along the fence line that morning, watching Elsa finish another careful twist of wire beneath the rising sun, he understood that the quiet routine of the ranch had begun traveling farther than any of them had expected. And somewhere beyond the horizon, decisions were beginning to form that might soon return to the ranch road the same way the government sedan had appeared the day before, quietly, but with consequences that reached far beyond a simple fence line in the Texas pasture. The morning sun rose slowly over Callahan Ranch, spreading a wide band of gold across the Texas plains as another day began beneath the open sky. The wind moved gently through the pasture grass, carrying the faint scent of cedar and damp soil from the irrigation ditch that continued guiding water through the garden rows behind the barn. From a distance, the ranch looked exactly the way it had for years. The fence line stretched straight across the land. The windmill turned beside the well pump. Cattle moved quietly through the fields with the same patient rhythm they had always followed. Yet the quiet routine that defined the ranch had begun to carry a deeper meaning for the people who worked there. Jack Callahan sat easily in the saddle near the pasture fence, one hand resting on the saddle horn as he watched the morning labor crew move along the cedar posts once more. The sun had not yet climbed high, and the shadows of the fence stretched long across the grass like dark lines drawn across the land. The foreman walked ahead of the group with his small notebook tucked beneath one arm, making occasional marks as the workers completed each section of fence inspection. The new instructions from the district office had made the paperwork heavier, but the work itself remained the same. Cedar posts, tight wire, careful hands ensuring the line would hold through wind and rain. Elsa Hartmann moved quietly along the middle of the line again, carrying the same hammer and coil of wire she had used since the first morning she arrived on the ranch. Her movements were steady and patient. She checked each strand with a light tap before tightening it against the post, then stepped back to examine the tension the same way a craftsman studies finished work. Jack had seen many ranch hands over the years. Some rushed through tasks just to finish them. Others treated the work like something that deserved attention. Elsa belonged to the second kind. The young horse from the pasture wandered closer again, as it had done nearly every day since the workers began repairing the fence. The animal approached slowly, ears forward, until it stood beside the section where Elsa worked. She paused briefly and rested her hand against the top rail of the fence, speaking softly to the horse in German. The animal lowered its head and remained calm beside her while the hammer tapped lightly against the wire. Jack watched the quiet exchange with a thoughtful expression. It had become a familiar moment in the rhythm of each morning. Some routines formed without anyone planning them. The sun climbed steadily higher across the sky as the work continued along the fence line. The foreman eventually closed his notebook and looked down the completed stretch of posts with quiet satisfaction. "That is the last section," he said. "Fence looks strong." The guard standing beside the transport truck checked his watch and nodded toward the workers. "Time to head back." The tools were gathered into the crate and carried toward the vehicle parked near the ranch gate. Elsa walked with the others across the pasture road, brushing dust from her hands as she approached the truck. Jack guided his horse forward until he reached the fence beside the gate just as the group arrived. The guard opened the rear gate, and the workers began climbing into the truck bed. Elsa stepped up last, gripping the metal rail with one hand before pulling herself onto the wooden bench inside. For a moment, she looked out across the ranch again the way she had on the first day. The wide pasture stretched beneath the bright Texas sky. The garden rows stood green beside the irrigation ditch. The windmill turned slowly near the well pump. Jack tipped his hat toward her from the saddle. Elsa returned the familiar nod. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The quiet respect that had grown between them required no explanation. The truck engine started a moment later and rolled slowly down the ranch road toward the hills where the prisoner camp waited beyond the horizon. Dust rose behind the tires, drifting through the warm air before settling again across the pasture. Jack remained beside the fence long after the vehicle disappeared from view. The wind moved gently across the grass, bending the tall stalks in slow waves beneath the sun. The ranch returned once again to the quiet rhythm it had known for generations. Yet the small story that had unfolded across that land had already traveled farther than the pasture fence. Weeks passed, and the war continued across distant continents while life on the ranch followed the same steady pace of seasons and weather. The irrigation ditch continued guiding water through the garden rows. The fence line remained strong against the wind. The cattle grazed peacefully beneath the wide Texas sky. But somewhere beyond the hills and highways, the reports written by government officials moved through offices in distant cities. Papers crossed desks. Decisions were discussed in rooms far removed from the quiet fields of Callahan Ranch. The details recorded in those reports were simple. A ranch, a labor crew, a prisoner who worked with unusual care and calm. Yet sometimes small details carried more weight than expected. One autumn afternoon months later, long after the storm that had first revealed the weakness in the irrigation ditch, Jack stood beside the garden field watching the water flow through the same curved channel Elsa had shaped that morning. The land looked peaceful beneath the fading sunlight. The windmill turned slowly beside the well pump. The fence line stretched across the pasture exactly as it had that summer. Jack rested one hand on the cedar rail and followed the water with his eyes as it moved steadily through the soil. A small adjustment in the earth had changed the way the water traveled across the land. He thought about that for a moment while the evening breeze moved through the field. History often remembered battles and speeches, but sometimes the quietest moments carried the greatest meaning. A calm voice beside a fence, a careful suggestion about water and soil, a small gesture of respect between two people who met in the middle of a war they had not created. The wind passed gently across the pasture again, bending the tall grass beneath the wide Texas sky. And in that quiet place where the land still followed its patient rhythm, the truth of the moment remained simple and clear. She never raised her voice. She raised the standard.